There is nothing quite like the World Cup when it comes to drama, upsets, and often career-defining moments. In light of that fact, and following a few requests, I'm going to be taking a look at the biggest surprise at each of the 21 editions of the World Cup since the very first finals took place in Uruguay in 1930. Whether it be a team that surprised people for good or bad, an individual result, or even a single moment. 21 is of course 3 times 7, therefore this video is staying true to the roots of the channel. That also means this video runs the risk of being 3 times as long as a normal video, especially when every one of these entries could merit an entire video unto themselves, so I'm going to have to be extremely terse. Here are some of the biggest surprises from every single World Cup finals. 1930. USA make the semis. No one really knew how the World Cup would turn out when Uruguay hosted the first finals in 1930. There was excitement in South America, but most European countries had to be dragged there kicking and screaming by Jules Rimet. Only 4 European teams made the journey and only 1 reached the knockout stages. The tournament surprise packages were undoubtedly the United States, who beat Paraguay and Belgium 3-0 to top their group before getting battered 6-1 by Argentina in the semi-finals. The conventional wisdom for many years was that the success of the US team was built around a group of ringers drafted in from England and Scotland, but this wasn't really the case. Whilst 6 of the US's 60-man squad were born in Britain, 4 of them emigrated to the United States either as children or teenagers, and the other 2 were hardly ringers, having played just a handful of games in the Football League. So the US MNT's best ever World Cup performance cannot be so easily dismissed, and it deserves its inclusion here, along with an honourable mention for the surprising disappointment of the Brazilians who exited in the group stages. 1934. Italy beat the Wunder team. As you probably already know, the hosts of World Cups tend to get some generous decisions, and never has that been more true than in 1934, where Benito Mussolini handpicked Italy's referees. Austria were the crack team heading into the 1934 finals, with their Wunder team, who had comfortably beaten Italy 4-2 earlier that year in the Central European Cup. Whether fairly or by nefarious means, and that's another discussion for another video, the hosts Italy defeated Austria 1-0 in the semi-finals and Czechoslovakia 2-1 in the final to become the first World Cup winners from Europe. 1938. Cuba beat Romania. Make no mistake, Romania were by no means powerhouses of the European game in the 1930s, but they were one of only 3 nations worldwide to feature in each of the first 3 editions of the World Cup. They were veterans of the competition in comparison to Cuba then, who were the first Caribbean nation to play at a World Cup finals, having only been offered a place since they were one of only 2 teams from the Americas not to boycott the finals in France. Romania may not have been powerhouses, but Cuba hadn't even played an officially sanctioned international match for over 3 years, their most recent fixture having been a 2-1 defeat to Costa Rica in 1935. Nonetheless, they came out swinging, and despite going behind, they fought back to draw 3-3 with Romania in Toulouse before beating them 2-1 in a replay only 4 days later. Unfortunately, the fairy tale ended in the quarterfinals, where Cuba were battered 8-0 by a Swedish side that would themselves lose 5-1 to Hungary in the semi-finals. Football, eh? Don't you just love it? Elsewhere, Germany were dumped out in the first round by Switzerland despite having just annexed Austria and poached all their best players. 1950. The amateurs defeat the aristocrats. There was a bit of a scuffle during the late 1930s and 40s, which, among other things, meant there was no World Cup for 12 years. Damn Nazis. When football returned, England decided that they'd take a stab at this whole World Cup thing. It didn't go well. The aristocrats of the game, who had ruled Europe up until the late 1940s, were found wanting in the searing heat of Brazil. The England players were exhausted, without some of their best players, and unwell from the food they'd been given, but there could be no excuses for losing to the rank amateurs of the United States. In one of football's all-time greatest upsets, the USA bested England 1-0 in Belo Horizonte, and a subsequent 1-0 defeat to Spain saw the 3 line sent packing. The other great shock of the 1950 World Cup was of course Uruguay's triumph against the host nation Brazil, prompting a national outpouring of distress known as the Maracanazo. 1954. The Miracle of Bern. Germany beating Hungary may seem perfectly normal in 2020, but 66 years ago, it was the greatest upset of the century. Hungary enjoyed an era of domination in European football during the early 1950s, which hasn't been replicated since, and their success in Switzerland was considered something of a formality. During the group stages, Hungary had beaten West Germany 8-3, and many expected a similar result when the two teams met in the final. Through a perfect storm of dreadful weather, revolutionary German studs, some contentious refereeing decisions, Sepp Herberger's smart tactics, and an injury to Ferenc Puskás, West Germany came back from being 2 goals down within the first 8 minutes to defeat the world's finest team 3-2. There have since been accusations that the West German players received performance-enhancing drugs, claims denied by the surviving members of the team and the DFB, who claimed the players were only ever injected with glucose and vitamin C. 1958. Pelé and Fontaine star as Sweden reached the final. There were many shocks at the 1958 World Cup, which would almost undoubtedly be considered the most entertaining World Cup of all time had it been broadcast worldwide in full colour. At the age of 17, Pelé arrived at that tournament unknown to the rest of the world, and departed as the finest footballer on the face of the earth. Just Fontaine only started for France due to an injury to Les Bleus' first-choice centre-forward in a warm-up game, yet he proceeded to score 13 goals in a single finals, a record which still hasn't and may never be beaten. Meanwhile, the host nation once again overachieved as Sweden overcame the Soviet Union and West Germany en route to a date with Pelé's Brazil in the final. 1962. The Italians collapse. Italy had failed to qualify for the World Cup for the first time in 1958, despite still being the tournament's joint most successful team, but they were expected to return with a bang in Chile. Italy had a star-studded squad featuring several foreign-born internationals, including the 1961 Ballon d'Or winner Omar Savori. For the next 3 seasons, Italian teams would come to dominate the European game, but the 1962 World Cup ended in disaster. Having drawn their opening game 0-0 with West Germany, the Italians then faced the host nation Chile in the most violent World Cup game of all time. Prior to kickoff, tensions between the two nations had reached fever pitch due to scathing remarks made by journalists from both nations. Fired up, the two teams proceeded to kick and indeed punch lumps out of each other, and Italy had 2 players dismissed in the first half as Chile won 2-0. The Italians bounced back against Switzerland, but it was too little, too late, as they caught the first plane back to Rome. 1966. North Korea. There was no lack of drama at the 1966 World Cup in England, from dubious refereeing decisions to the majesty of Eusebio and Brazil's early exit. The greatest shock of all, though, of which there can be no doubt, was the performance of the plucky North Koreans. Little is known of the secretive Asian state now, but that was even truer back in the 1960s. Not much was expected of North Korea's diminutive and unknown players, but their fast and frantic style would catch their more revered opponents off guard. Following a 3-0 defeat to the fellow communists of the Soviet Union in their opener, North Korea earned an impressive 1-0 draw with Chile before battling to a remarkable 1-0 win against Italy at Essen Park in Middlesbrough. North Korea progressed to the quarter-finals, where they raced into an extraordinary 3-goal lead against Portugal, but 4 goals from Eusebio spearheaded a comeback for the Europeans and an end to one of the all-time great showings from a minnow at a World Cup. 1970. The Wonder of Peru. Peru made their first appearance in a World Cup since 1930 and 1970, having lost both of their 2 games in their only other appearance 40 years earlier. Peru had beaten Argentina twice in qualifying, so there was good reason to believe they could compete, but expectations remained fairly low. Peru began their tournament just 2 days after the Ancash earthquake, the nation's most catastrophic natural disaster and the world's deadliest avalanche, but Peru brought pride to a wounded nation with a 3-2 win against Bulgaria. Morocco were then comfortably beaten 3-0, ensuring knockout qualification as the joyous Teófilo Cubillas took Mexico by storm. Brazil would break Peruvian hearts in the quarterfinals, winning 4-2 in what would prove to be the tournament winners' toughest knockout stage tie. 1974. East vs West. West Germany defeating the footballing genius of Cruyff and Michels was an upset of sorts, but the biggest shock of the 1974 World Cup came when the hosts faced their former compatriots turned divided neighbours. Germany had been cut in 2 following World War II, with hostilities intensified by the building of the Berlin Wall in 1961. West Germany had outperformed East Germany in many respects since the war had ended, and football was no exception. Despite having been touted as comfortable favourites, West Germany were beaten 2-1 in Hamburg in a result which saw East Germany top the group. In the second group stage, West Germany topped their group, going on to win the finals, whilst East Germany were dumped out by the Netherlands and Brazil, but no one can ever rob them of their success against their more illustrious neighbours. 1978. Peru proved potent once again. Who was writing Peru off after their heroics in 1970? Well, lots of people actually. The South Americans had failed to qualify for the 1974 World Cup, and starman Teófilo Cubillas was coming off the back of his worst season with the Fort Lauderdale Strikers in the NASL, having only scored 4 goals. The big players turn up for the big occasions though, and Cubillas was monumental for Peru. Only Mario Kempes scored more at that tournament as Peru topped their first group ahead of eventual finalist the Netherlands before being put to the sword in their second group stage against the powerhouses of Brazil and Argentina. Still, Peru reached their second quarter-final in just 8 years, and Teófilo Cubillas remains one of only 3 players, alongside Thomas Muller and Miroslav Klose, to have scored 5 or more goals at multiple World Cup finals. 1982. Algeria humble West Germany. There will always be a dark cloud that lingers over the 1982 World Cup due to the game that became known as the Disgrace of Gijón, in which West Germany and Austria essentially fixed a match against one another to ensure that they both reached the knockout stages. It prompted FIFA into making all group deciders be played simultaneously, but that was little consolation for Algeria. They went into the 1982 World Cup relatively unknown, but they had a well-drilled squad with a sprinkling of flair, most notably in the form of the great Lakhdar Belhoumi. Belhoumi was in fine form in Algeria's opener, as they recorded one of the great World Cup upsets by beating West Germany 2-1. A 2-0 defeat to Austria meant only a win against Chile would give them a solid chance to progress, which is exactly what they did. With that, only a 1 or 2 goal win for West Germany against Austria could prevent them from progressing, but after 10 minutes of German attacks, West Germany took the lead and neither teams attempted to score for the rest of the game. Algeria were outraged, rightly, and this team deserved more. 1986. Mighty Morocco. The 1986 World Cup will forever be remembered for the devilishness and genius of Diego Armando Maradona. Whilst people may have been surprised by just how good El Diego could be, I wouldn't say it was the greatest shock of the second finals to have been held in Mexico. No, I would have to award that title to Morocco, who were making only their second appearance at the finals, having failed to win any of their 3 games 16 years earlier. Morocco set many firsts in 1986 under Brazilian head coach Jose Faria as the first Arab team to reach the round of 16, the first African team to top a World Cup group, and the first African team to reach the second round. Morocco topped a group containing England, Poland and Portugal before losing 1-0 to eventual finalist West Germany, courtesy of an 88th minute winner from Lothar Matthäus. Morocco returned to North Africa with their heads held very high. Meanwhile, another shock in 86 was Denmark beating Uruguay by 6-1. 1990. Cameroon. Morocco had tasted success in 1986, and another African nation was to go a step further in 1990. Cameroon are fondly remembered as a lovable underdog at the 1990 World Cup, spearheaded by their smiley veteran assassin Roger Milla at centre forward, but they perhaps don't get the credit they deserve as actually being a very good all-round team. In only their second World Cup, Cameroon topped their group ahead of Romania, Argentina and the Soviet Union. They beat Colombia in the round of 16, and it took England until extra time to end Milla and his merry men's journey as the first African nation to reach the World Cup quarter-finals. Trailblazers, blessed with plenty of talent, other African teams have followed in Cameroon's footsteps since, but none have gone further. 1994. The Saudis make a storm. Saudi Arabia have qualified for 5 of the last 7 World Cup finals, but when they travelled to the United States in 1994, they were making their World Cup debut. No Asian nation had progressed from the group stages since North Korea in 1966, so little was expected of these World Cup virgins. With veteran Saudi legend Majid Abdullah as their talisman though, Saudi Arabia were looking to take some scalps as they took flight, headed to Washington. Saudi Arabia beat Morocco and Belgium, finishing joint top of their group with Belgium and the Netherlands, setting up a round of 16 tie against Sweden. Saudi Arabia lost to the Swedes, but it was a tremendous World Cup debut from the little fancied Middle Eastern nation. Meanwhile, Sweden themselves reaching the semi-finals along with Bulgaria was something of an upset. Oh, and of course, there was the shock of Diego Maradona failing a drugs test. Yeah, alright, I guess that's about as much of a shock as England losing a penalty shootout. Moving swiftly on. 1998. Spain sink in Saint-Etienne. Spain's golden generation obviously arrived in the 2000s, but their class of 98 really ought to have been good enough to reach the knockout stages. Only eventual finalists Italy beat them in 94, yet in France in 98, a team containing the likes of Fernando Hierro, Luis Enrique, and a young Raul managed to throw away a gift of a group containing only Nigeria, Paraguay, and Bulgaria, winning only one game and boarding a flight back to Madrid at the earliest possible opportunity. Elsewhere, credit to Croatia, who shocked a few by taking third place. 2002. France fall off a cliff. We may now be used to France either winning or spectacularly failing at major finals, but back in 2002, it was quite novel. Having won the 1998 World Cup and Euro 2000, France went into the 2002 World Cup as favourites alongside Brazil, with a star-studded squad which boasted names like Henry, Zidane, Thuram, Desailly, Vieira, Petit, Makelele and Trezeguet. That group of players managed to finish bottom of a group topped by Denmark, meanwhile Senegal finished second. Zidane was injured in a warm-up game and only featured in France's final encounter, but even without their talismanic number 10, Les Bleus ought to have cruised into the knockout stages. South Korea was of course the other major shock of the first World Cup to be held in Asia, reaching the semi-finals, albeit with just a little bit of help from the referees. As I've said, the same goes for just about every host nation. 2006. Zizou loses his head. It's France stealing the headlines again in 2006, but while Zidane missed most of the 2002 World Cup due to injury, he came back with a bang in 2006. In his final tournament in football, Zizou rolled back the years with some virtuoso performances, most notably against Brazil. He inspired France to the final, where they would face Italy, but France's main man let his country down in front of 69,000 people at the Olympia Stadium. Zizou decided to plant his head into Marco Materazzi's chest after the perennial wind-up merchant exchanged some nasty words about either Zizou's mother or sister, depending on which account you choose to believe. Regardless of what was said, the best way to make Materazzi pay would have been on the pitch, and it's worth noting that Italy's success at the 2006 World Cup was something of a shock in of itself, occurring during a backdrop of the Calciopoli scandal. 2010. Italy finished bottom of the world's worst group. A little like France, Italy are no strangers to a bit of a spontaneous combustion following immense success. As reigning World Cup champions, they couldn't really have asked for an easier group in South Africa, drawn against Paraguay, Slovakia, and New Zealand in Group F. An ageing but talented Italian squad containing the likes of Buffon, Cannavaro, and Pirlo ought to have made at least the knockout stages, yet they finished bottom of one of the weakest World Cup groups ever assembled. It also came as a bit of a shock in South Africa that you couldn't hear anything over the vuvuzelas, that Howard Webb allowed Nigel de Jong to try and claim Xabi Alonso's life without sending him off, and that the ball didn't seem to actually be round. 2014. Germany beat Brazil 7-1. I don't think there can be too many doubts about this one, despite the impressive run of Costa Rica in Brazil. There was huge pressure on the host nation, despite the fact that they didn't have their most talented generation of players, and an injury to Neymar and a suspension for Thiago Silva seriously exposed that fact. Brazil were torn to shreds by Germany in one of the most shocking World Cup results of all time, as the Brazilian public couldn't quite believe what was unfolding in front of their eyes. Elsewhere, Spain's capitulation in South America off the back of a trio of consecutive major trophy wins came as some surprise as they exited at the group stage following defeats to Chile and the Netherlands. 2018. Löw loses to Mexico and South Korea. One lesson to take from recent World Cups is that the reigning champions are more than capable of being humbled at the earliest possible opportunity. No team illustrates that fact more emphatically than Germany in 2018, having looked so dominant and composed only 4 years earlier. Despite still having a brilliant squad, Joachim Löw's men were a real shambles in Russia. They managed to finish bottom of a group containing Sweden, Mexico and South Korea, with their only win coming courtesy of a 95th minute Toni Kroos free kick. As with 1998, credit must go to Croatia again, who went one step further in Russia, beating England in extra time in the semi-finals before being well beaten by the tournament's best team France in the final. So that's it for today's video. There are of course many other World Cup shocks and surprises that I could have mentioned, but those are just one from each World Cup, with a couple of honourable mentions thrown in. Thank you all as ever for watching, hit the like button if you enjoyed today's video, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and obviously do feel free to subscribe to HITC Sevens and turn on notifications. Oh, and you can also follow me on Twitter or Instagram, where the username is simply at HITC Sevens on both platforms.